Do they have a mic? Okay. Yeah, let's just start. Let me just ask him before we start.
That one's working. So yeah, try to lean into that and talk. Whenever you're ready. Just let everyone know we're starting. So let's go now.
Should we just say we're going to start in like 2 minutes?
Yeah, you can say that.
Do you want to start? Hello, everyone. We're just going to start in a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes. Okay. People coming in. Yeah, decently full. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, Dig In, our Health on a Platter. UofT Talks and Institute of Medical Sciences is proud to present our event on food science. Throughout this evening, we'll be discussing the relationships between food and our physical and mental health, learning about current efforts to revolutionize food engineering, and discussing the policy and sustainability challenges that impact our relationships with food. My name is Sufyan, and this is Mahmoud. We're a graduate student here at the Institute of Medical Science, and we have the pleasure of representing a fantastic group of students as your MC for this evening's. UofT Talks is an annual event that looks at an exciting health-related topic each year from a multitude of perspectives. This year, we are proudly introducing Dig In, our Health on a Platter. In addition to the discussions tonight, we're interested in hearing from you. This year, we are using #DigInForWellness to engage our audience in social media. We ask that you use this hashtag as you tweet and post about our event tonight. We hope you enjoy our event this evening.
Before we begin, I'll be sharing our land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and the Institute of Medical Science operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. June is National Indigenous History Month. We recognize the complex perceptions of and barriers to healthcare that are still experienced by Indigenous peoples in what we call Canada today. As this meeting is being held in a hybrid format, you may be joining us tonight from land that traditionally belongs to other territories. We urge you to research the territories of land you're currently residing in and learn the history.
We'll be starting shortly, but before we do, here's a quick video from our sponsors, the Gardner Foundation.
And your incredible research that inspires us all and is changing the future of medicine. Cheers.
Being a Gardner Award recipient is a life-changing event. A lot of the program is very inspirational to the next generation of scientists.
The biggest excitement is really sharing what we do with others.
Finding and feeling that passion, I think, is key. As research for most people, it's a long game.
Hello everyone, my name is Janet Rosent and I'm President and Scientific Director of the Gardner Foundation, a proud sponsor of today's event. At the Gardner Foundation, our core mission is to recognise and reward scientific excellence through the annual prestigious Canada Gardner Awards for Health Research. But beyond the awards, we also aim to bring together the world's best scientists to address important issues facing us as a society today. Together, we can help the public understand the importance of scientific research and inspire young people to tackle the world's problems with new ideas and enthusiasm. Today's event is fully aligned with our mission and we're proud to provide support. Throughout the year, we host various events bringing together the world's leading researchers. I encourage you to stay up to date on all our upcoming events and announcements on our website, gardner.org, and follow us on social media at Gardner Awards. We look forward to seeing you.
Okay, awesome. So before we begin, I just wanted to briefly run us through the schedule this evening. So this is a quick overview of the evening. We will begin with brief talks from our exciting lineup of keynote speakers to introduce you to their backgrounds and areas of expertise. We will then have a dinner break at 7:30 along with our interactive workshops. We will then reconvene here at 8:15 for an hour-long panel discussion to hear insights from our keynote speakers on diverse food science topics. So tonight, we're hearing from four amazing speakers. If you have any questions during the talks, please write them down and you can ask your question during the panel discussion session. Okay, so without further ado, I'm gonna introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ahmed El-Soimi. Dr. El-Soimi holds a PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Toronto and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University. His research focuses on how genetics can impact responses to specific diets. He's also the founder of Nutrigenomics Incorporation, a company that aims to personalize nutrition based on individual genetic profiles. Thank you, Dr. El-Soimi, for joining us this evening, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming on a Friday evening. I just want to start by saying, kudos to the organizers, the students who put this together. Maybe we can have a huge round of applause to the organizers. I've attended many, many events, and this is as professional as it gets, so awesome job, guys. What I wanted to do this evening is share with you some of the work that we've been doing here at U of T in the field of precision nutrition. So in the Department of Nutritional Sciences, in the Temerity Faculty of Medicine, our Department of Nutritional Sciences focuses on trying to understand the role of nutrition in health and disease. So my specific area of specialization is on precision nutrition or personalized nutrition. And that's where we try to understand why some people respond differently from others to the same foods, beverages, and supplements that they consume. All right? How many people here can't stand the taste of cilantro? Cilantro, way up high? Look at all the hands. People that can't stand the taste of cilantro. How many people think it's the most delicious herb ever created? Right, you must be looking at each other thinking, what's wrong with these people? Right? But there's a gene for that. It's a gene that affects your sense of smell that ultimately affects your sense of taste. And some people just perceive it totally different because of this single alteration in their genome that affects their ability to perceive it. Same thing with lactose. Some people can't consume dairy products. They have lactose intolerance. Again, there's a gene for that. So again, the ultimate goal of research in this area is to try to see if we can use genetic testing to understand what works best for you as an individual. Now, from a research perspective, we can think of really two sides of a coin. Those were supposed to be arrows. Something happened in the merger of the file, but basically there was an arrow going from diet to genes and then genes to diet. So you can think of it as really two sides of a coin. We know diet can affect genes, right? Nutrients can turn on or turn off certain genes. And if we know the function of those genes, that can affect certain biological pathways. And the flip side is illustrated by what was supposed to be a bottom arrow here, how genes affect the way we respond to diet. So again, genes affect the metabolism of all kinds of things, everything actually that we ingest. Now another element of this bottom arrow here is before a gene can even act on a dietary factor, genes can also influence the foods that we select, right? I just gave you that example of cilantro. So we actually did some research a number of years ago. This was work done by a former PhD student, Karen Enney, in my lab. She's currently the director of clinical services for the company Nutrigenomics, where we identified a gene that affects glucose transport in the brain and showed that some people who have a particular version of this gene, it's found in about 25 to 30% of the population, they consume more sugar on a daily basis because they have impaired glucose sensing in the brain. I see some of you kind of nodding, saying, oh yeah, I have that gene. And so it was the kind of thing that, got a lot of media attention. This is the front page of the Toronto Star. Craving something sweet, blame it on your DNA. A little bit sensationalist, but this is what sells newspapers. I was just a little bit annoyed because it had here on the front page, says UofT nutrition expert, and then my name is buried like on page A17 in the middle. So my name didn't actually make the front page of the Toronto Star. But anyhow, when we look at the science of nutrigenomics, which is a branch of nutritional sciences that, as you can gather by the name, deals with the interface between nutrition and our genetic makeup. If we trace the path from virtually any nutritional factor and any health outcome, if there have been enough research studies, we tend to see this heterogeneity of response, inconsistencies. Right? How many times do we pick up a newspaper and hear, oh, study says coffee is good for us. Another day, study comes out, says, no, coffee is bad for us. Another day, coffee doesn't do anything. Well, there's a lot of reasons for those inconsistencies. I'm using coffee as an example, but we actually published a paper way back in 2006 in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, showing that if you have a particular version of a gene that affects how quickly you metabolize caffeine, coffee either increases your risk of a heart attack or decreases your risk, the complete opposite effect. And so I've tried to illustrate it's now a blue box, it used to be a black box, 3 possible genotypes, variations in the sequence of your genome, that if we can identify this, and we can say that the recommendations that we give in some individuals will actually improve their health, that's great. In some instances, the recommendations we give doesn't do anything, and that's okay. But what about cases where the advice that we're giving actually causes harm? And if there's a way of identifying those individuals, finding something else for them, that's obviously something that we want to do. So again, you pick your nutritional factor and you pick your health outcome. Sodium and blood pressure. We tell everybody to cut back on sodium. But for some people, if they lower their sodium too much, their risk of hard outcomes like heart attack and stroke actually goes up. Right? We used to call these people outliers, try to figure out how to get rid of them from our statistical analysis because they made our data look ugly. But more and more we find that these so-called outliers, based on their genetics, respond in the complete opposite direction. So what if you're an outlier where the advice that Health Canada is giving you might actually cause harm? And if there's a way to find out, would you want that? So clearly, one size does not fit all. And we've known this for a very long time. In fact, one of the earliest references comes from the 1st century BC, where Lucretius noted that one man's food is another man's poison. What's good for one person might actually be harmful to somebody else. Well, we've come a long way, and with modern developments in molecular genetics and genomics, we can now pinpoint specific regions in the genome that can help us understand why some of us look and function differently, not only on the outside, but also on the inside. So these single letter alterations in the genome can explain why some people have straight hair versus curly hair or no hair, blue eyes versus brown eyes. So these single letter alterations can also have profound effects on our metabolism. It can explain why one person could metabolize caffeine very quickly and someone else doesn't. And that means coffee can be harmful to one person but not somebody else. So when we look to see where and how genetics can impact our response to our foods and our nutritional environment, as I mentioned, genes influence our likes and dislikes, our sense of smell, our sense of taste. Genes can also influence our appetite. Some people need more of a particular macronutrient to get the same satiating effect, while others need to, they overconsume to get that same signal in the brain to say, okay, it's time to stop. And once a food is ingested, again, there's all kinds of genes that affect the absorption, the distribution, the cellular uptake, and the elimination of virtually everything that we ingest. So 4 cups of coffee for one person might be the equivalent dose of caffeine as 1 cup of coffee for somebody else, based on how quickly they metabolize caffeine, how slowly they absorb it, and ultimately how much reaches the target cell of interest. So to give you one example, the field of weight loss. It's a $77 billion industry in the United States alone. And there's all kinds of fad diets, right? There's low fat, low carb, keto, paleo, intermittent fasting, Atkins diet, the list goes on. The reason why these fad diets persist is because they actually work in some people. So the question is, how do I know if it's going to work for me, or if you're a practitioner, for any of your clients? Now here we're not trying to use genetics to predict obesity or weight gain, because there's really no point. There have been hundreds of genetic association studies showing small effects of various genes on waist circumference and body mass index and adiposity. What we're trying to say is, for someone who does want to lose weight, can they use genetics to determine the most effective strategy? And so there have been a number of studies now, randomized, controlled clinical trials, the gold standard of scientific evidence, showing that things like a high-protein diet, that's common in a lot of weight loss diets, actually work in individuals who have a particular version of a gene called FTO. And if you don't have that version of that gene, a high-protein diet is absolutely useless. This is based on randomized controlled clinical trials. So you might hear about a lot of popular weight loss trials saying, oh yeah, you got to jack up your protein. And a lot of studies showing, on average, in some groups, that a high-protein diet does work. That's all driven by those individuals, the 25 to 30% that have that version of that gene. They respond significantly to a high-protein diet, but the rest of the people just don't. But we usually don't take genetics into account. We just do group averages and say, okay, on average, this group that went on a high-protein diet, on average, they lost more weight, so therefore, everybody should go on a high-protein diet. But again, if you look at the scientific evidence, it's only if you have a particular version of a gene. Now, one question that some people might ask is, well, what happens when you give people their genetic information? What are they going to do with that? Well, we thought that's an interesting question, one that had never been asked before. On the one hand, someone might say, you know what? I have that gene. It's going to motivate me to eat a healthier diet. But the flip side could be this concept of genetic determinism or fatalism, where a person might say, you know what? It's all genetic. It's all in my genes. There's nothing I can do. Pass me the potato chips and a remote and leave me alone. Now, this concept really applies more to disease-causing genes. And there are some cases where we do have certain genes that we really can't do anything about it, right? And so if you tell someone, you have the gene for early Alzheimer's disease, good luck with that. Yeah, there's nothing they can really do that's specific to them. But if you look at the right kind of gene, the ones that we call metabolic genes, right? Like the gene that affects the rate of caffeine metabolism. And if you're a so-called slow metabolizer of caffeine, you need to limit your caffeine intake. That's something that you can do. That's actionable genetic information, as opposed to this deterministic kind. So we've actually shown, again, using randomized controlled clinical trials, that if you give people the right kind of genetic information, that will in fact motivate them to change their eating habits. So just to wrap up, a number of years ago I gave a talk at the first international conference on nutrigenomics at UC Davis in California, and the headline in the newspaper the next day was "Genetics May Define Diets of the Future," as though this was something that we might be doing 30 or 40 years from now. But fast forward a decade later, and the Wall Street Journal covered not only our research here at UofT, but also the company's translation of those discoveries. And they wrote a nice piece to say, you know what, this is not something that's futuristic, it's here today. The science is here, some of the services are here for those who have access to this kind of information and who want to go beyond just the generic, standard, one-size-fits-all recommendations to figure out what works best for them. There are opportunities for them to get this kind of information. So I'll finish off then and leave you with this quote. Even though the term nutrigenomics is fairly new, the science is quite ancient, and Hippocrates noted over 2,500 years ago that positive health requires a knowledge of man's primary constitution. It's really just an old-fashioned way of saying genotype. And he went on to say, and of the powers of various foods, both those natural to them and those resulting from human skill. So clearly, he was talking about personalized nutrition. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. El Sohaimi, for your amazing talk. I am now pleased to present our second speaker, Dr. Karen Davison. Dr. Davison is a researcher at the Institute for Life Course and Aging at the University of Toronto and works in clinical dietetics practice with individuals diagnosed with mental and cognitive health conditions. Her research focuses on nutrition and its relationships with physical, mental, and cognitive health. Thank you, Dr. Davison, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Great, thank you. And how do I put up my slide? Just, oh, there we go, okay. All right, good. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank UofT Talks for inviting me. This is really an honor and a pleasure. And I'm going to be focusing on nutrition and mental health. And just to tell you a little bit about myself to start out with, I do research in the Faculty of Social Work in the Institute of Life Course and Aging. And in my clinical role, I work with individuals where the primary diagnosis is a traumatic brain injury or a neurodegenerative condition of which mental health comes into play a lot. I do some other work as well, but I won't get into that, stuff on long COVID. So the objectives here, I really want to just start out with talking about these complex relationships between nutrition and mental health, and then talk a little bit about the research, and then talk about a little bit of the interventions that are out there, and try and end off with suggesting how we might foster nutritional and mental health in future strategies. So starting off with the first objective, when I talk about mental health, and I really want to emphasize that I'm not talking about someone diagnosed with a mental health condition. So I like to refer to Corey Key's model, which is a two-continuum model of mental health, where we can have individuals that are diagnosed with a mental health condition, yet are doing just fine or not so good. And then we can have individuals that no mental health condition, again, can be doing well or not doing well. So on the one side, if you're looking at the slide, and to your right, those would be individuals with a mental health condition. The strategies around nutrition would focus on getting their symptoms under control, getting them into remission, and being able to function. If, on the other hand, an individual doesn't have a mental health condition or diagnosed with it, the strategies are involved in improving their cognition, their behavior, and their emotional regulation. So when I think about mental health as well, I like to think of it from a life course perspective. And I like to refer to this unifying theory of neurobiology, where you start off with your antecedents, so what you come into life with, so your genetic environment, the prenatal environment, as well as your life experiences and your choices and habits. And then we come across a number of different exposures over the lifespan, of which nutrition, I'm not sure what happened to my slide there, but nutrition is at the top there where the little lightning bolt goes down, is a key one, a key risk factor. And then you have all of these interactions that occur with your body systems, key ones being the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, and the immune system, of which you can have varying levels of mental health that results. So when I talk about nutrition and mental health, a key period, of course, is in the perinatal and early years, so 0 to 6. And one of the things that, when we talk about the prenatal environment, it gets focused on the maternal diet, but there's also research that suggests that the paternal diet is just as important. When we talk about exposures over the lifespan, we often think about diet, but there's other things to consider, such as key events that have happened historically, such as the Dutch famine, where the Germans cut off the food and fuel supplies. This was in 1944 to 1945, over the winter to the Dutch people. And there was cohort research that was done from that that showed that when a mom was pregnant during this period, the offspring in later life had higher risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And then there was intergenerational effects. So those that had that generation that had their kids then had they were smaller in size and they tended to have more health issues over the lifespan. Another example is Flint, Michigan, where there was lead introduced into the water supply when they switched over from Detroit water system to the Flint River. And children exposed to that, of course, have lifelong effects. This is a map of Toronto, if you don't recognize it. And this is really looking at food deserts, food insecurity, where they've mapped out, this was done a few years ago, and they mapped out different regions according to proximity to grocery stores, as well as being in a food desert. So the purple region, just very briefly, represents sort of the non-priority neighborhoods of where there's food deserts. So you can see that there's more of that, and it's also based on income level. And then when we think about over the lifespan, there's different environments which are more key to nutritional mental health. So in the early years, it's exposure to family, school, daycare. And then as we get older into adulthood, it's really individual exposure, some workplace, as well as community. All right, moving on to the next, a little bit about the research. So when we talk about nutrition and mental health, there's been research that's really come out in the last 20 years in different countries. And to kind of summarize it in one slide, the cross-sectional research shows that there's diet patterns that are correlated with mood, particularly depression and anxiety. And there's been associations with poor diets having increased depression and anxiety. Longitudinal studies where you can determine cause and effect has shown, particularly studies done in Australia by Felice Jacka, these diet patterns that can predict depression, so diagnosis of depression. And then when we take these results together, we see that when we look at the diet, there's independent predictors. So you can be eating a very healthy diet, like the Mediterranean diet, yet if you are also eating a lot of processed foods, that is another independent predictor. So it's sort of offsetting your healthy diet. More recently, there's been some trials, of which the key one is a SMILES trial done in Australia, again by Felice Jacka, where there was dietitians that provided personal dietary advice and nutrition counseling, and there was improvement in depression symptoms, significant improvement compared to those that just received social support. So a little bit about my research, and it's been over about the last 10 to 12 years, so from my PhD forward. I did an investigation during my PhD of individuals with mood disorders, and that was in BC. And what the key findings from that study was that we found that the diet for those diagnosed with a mood disorder compared to general healthy population tended to be poor in diet quality. And then we also found that those that had intakes of key nutrients like folate and iron and the trace minerals, whether from food or food plus supplements, had improved symptoms, so mania and depression symptoms, as well as overall psychological functioning. From there, I went on to do research with the Canadian Community Health Survey data, national data that's available from Statistics Canada, and just some key findings from there is we found that, again, when we talk about poor mental health, independent predictors were food insecurity, poor diet quality, and intakes of key nutrients such as folate and iron. We also looked at another cycle where we looked at the association between food insecurity and suicide ideation and found a very significant association there. And then we also wanted to look at other factors such as eating disorder risk. So we're talking about people that have body image issues and individuals who have eating patterns which may, be characterized as unhealthy. And what we found is that there was this association with eating disorder risk, with diagnosis of psychiatric condition, compulsive behavior such as gambling, as well as substance use, and there was differences by sex. So in males, there was a heightened eating disorder risk, particularly with gambling and with substance use. Right, more recently, doing work with a Canadian longitudinal study in aging, and that's with the Faculty of Social Work here. And just very briefly, this is a national sample. They started tracking them in 2011, so recruiting individuals between 45 to 85 years. And they'll be tracking them for the next 15 to 20 years and looking at different health outcomes, of which mental health is one. So it's about 30,000 people. And I won't go into, because it's quite detailed, all the results that we've had so far, but these are the 4 mental health areas that we looked at with the baseline data. And what we found with depression, similar to other studies, we found that better fruit and vegetable intakes improved depression, better omega-3 fatty acids, improvements in depression. With anxiety, we found factors such as body composition was related to anxiety. With psychological distress, we found where people were eating more pulses and nuts had lower psychological distress. And when we looked at post-traumatic stress disorder as the outcome, interestingly, there was some association with chocolate intake, as well as a person's waist to height ratio, and also there was differences by sex when looking at alcohol intake. So for males that tended to consume alcohol, lower risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, and the reverse for females. All right, I'm going to end off here with talking a little bit about interventions. So a few years ago, Public Health Ontario invited me to a talk where they wanted me to talk about interventions, like go out there and research it and just tell us about it. So in doing that, we came up with 6 key points when it comes to nutrition and mental health interventions. So we want to make sure that any approaches that we do are positive mental health. So stigmatization is not part of the agenda. Making sure that the information intervention is embedded in evidence, so backed up by RCTs, for example. Equity focused, multifaceted, so one strategy is not going to work. That at an individual level, we use personalized capacity building approaches. So for example, gene testing results can be helpful. And then long-term research has shown that peer approaches and participatory approaches, you get better outcomes. So at the policy level, there's really a lot that can be done. So I'm just going to highlight one example here from my former PhD supervisor's research that she did with a colleague in New Zealand. So at the top, this is showing the earthquakes that were in Christchurch, New Zealand. And after the earthquakes, they took 3 groups of people. So diet as usual, and then diet as usual, and they added a B complex, and then diet as usual, and they added a broad spectrum micronutrient supplementation. And the measure was the depression, anxiety, stress scale. And so the green and the red that you see there, so the green is the, it's on the top graph there. The green is the B complex, and the red is the broad spectrum micronutrient supplementation. So you can see there was significantly better effects there. They also did a follow-up study with the floods that occurred in Alberta. They looked at vitamin D, and they looked at B complex and the broad spectrum micronutrient supplementation. So again, better effects with those more diverse nutrient supplements. And then when we look at, well, what if we don't do something, what is the impact? So this bottom part is showing research that was done after the wildfires in Fort McMurray. And you can see that at 2016, where the line goes where the fire was, so the diagnosis of affective disorders or mental health conditions were higher, upward trend, anxiety disorders, upward trend, substance abuse disorders, a little bit of a upward trend there. All right, so when we talk about interventions, so as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's different environments that come into play. So this is where we would want to do interventions. So for example, in the university setting, the Canadian Mental Health Association has programming around healthy minds, healthy campuses. Online counseling is available for more individualized approaches that are more accessible. And the last one there that on the slide was the Canadian Mental Health Association's Minding Our Bodies. And the toolkit is available, and that uses peer approaches, participatory approaches. All right, this slide is really just showing, again, if you're going to work with someone and you want to improve their mental health and nutrition status. So you consider things like genetic disposition, environmental factors, poor nutritional intake. The assessment, you want to be as comprehensive as possible, looking at physical factors, ideally getting gene testing in there, contextual factors, and then the management strategies, of course, medication, if the person does have a mental health condition, and then the adjunct to that is an individualized nutrition care plan. In more recent years, of course, we're recognizing the role of the microbiome and mental health. So there are many different strategies around that as well that can help to improve nutrition. So out of the University of Calgary, for example, they developed this app around My Healthy Gut, which helps people to make choices. And there's many different apps that are out there. As far as approaches, sometimes you need to go on just telling people what to eat, but actually using therapeutic approaches that will help to shape better eating habits. Cognitive behavior therapy is probably the most common one, but there's other ones, depending on the context, that would be relevant as well. And more recently in BC, they're using what's called narrative therapy, where people can tell their story over the lifespan around food and around mental health. And they develop it into a story and work with the counselor to develop better eating habits. This is just another example of an intervention, so virtual reality, so another innovative approach. This is an excerpt from a VR piece that we put together that focused on actually people getting their gene testing done and then how to interpret that in terms of nutrition labels. So they put on the goggles and they do this grocery store tour. All right, so that's just kind of a snapshot about nutrition, mental health, and different factors. And if I was to kind of summarize where we could move ahead, I think we need to really improve our understanding of complex gene-environment interactions, particularly in relation to mental health outcomes. We need to improve the data sources. So I talked about the CCHS and the CLSA. They're great data sources, but we really want more of that, especially looking at genetic data, objective indicators of nutrition, objective indicators of mental health. And then finally, at the health policy level, we want to ensure, population health, and we want universal applications, but we really need to ensure that we're personalizing and adapting to different subpopulations. And so we really want to work towards customization of nutrition plans that are going to further practice, programming, and policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davison, for a fantastic presentation. So now I'm going to present to you our third speaker, Dr. Ravi Selvagunapathy. He's a distinguished engineering professor of mechanical and biochemical engineering at McMaster University. His research interests are spread into many different fields, including tissue engineering, drug discovery, and more. He's a co-founder of Evolved Meats, a company that focuses on the production of lab-grown meats and has received the first tri-agency funding in the field of cultured meat in Canada through the New Frontiers program. Thank you, Dr. Selvagunapathy. I'll pass it on to you over.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's a beautiful day. At least the rain has stopped, so that's good. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this exciting new area that is evolving, has evolved in terms of the research sphere over the past 5-6 years or so, which is, sorry, there you go, which is cultivated meat, a way to grow meat without animals. I also lead a consortium of 5 universities: McMaster, Toronto, Guelph, Ottawa, and Alberta. And we are involved in sort of kickstarting this area of research in Canada. So I'll start with this slide here. So this shows meat supply per person or consumption per person in 1963 across the world. And then this one shows a few years later into 2017, right? And what you see is more red in this, or reddish tones in this figure. And this shows increased consumption all across the world, right? And if you look at the data a little bit more deeply, you see countries such as United States, where the meat consumption has grown. So in the developed world, it has grown a little bit. But then newly emerging countries such as China, where the income levels has really increased, what you see is a dramatic increase in consumption of meat, right? And so over this past year, there's been a steady growth in consumption of meat, various types of meat across the world. In the next 20, 30 years, what you're going to see is countries like India, where income levels are also raising, also increasing their consumption of meat. So there is an ever increasing demand for meat, and as income levels across the world increases, you're going to see an increasing amount of meat being consumed in these areas. However, one of the challenges is to meet that demand, right? Already, this is sort of a description of how land in the world is being used. 50% is of habitable land is being used for agriculture. Of that 50%, 77% is being devoted to raise crops or pasture lands that can then feed animals for meat cultivation and dairy, right? So already majority of our land is devoted to meat cultivation. If we want to have this extra demand met, then the only solution is going into this other bit, or to take away lands from forests, right? And that is essentially happening already in Amazon. Soybean cultivation to feed pigs or cattle has destroyed a significant amount of forest lands, and this has a direct impact in climate change, right? The storage of carbon is being reduced, and these kinds of intensive agricultural means is also releasing a lot of carbon into the environment. So this is sort of unsustainable. And what we have to do as a society is to find ways, alternative ways, where we can eliminate destruction of forests, return more of our land to its natural state, and as carbon sinks. In addition to that, animal agriculture also consumes other resources. So for instance, this is water consumption per kilogram of meat produced. And what you see is the larger the animal, the more lifespan the animal has, such as, for example, cattle consumes about 15,000 liters of water per kilogram of meat production, right? And again, this is a significant drain of a natural resource which is increasingly in demand. Furthermore, animal agriculture also results in greenhouse gas emissions. Cattle, just because of their longer lifespan, also is the major source of animal or greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture as a whole is about 9% globally, right, in terms of so what we need is, again, a solution that can address these problems. So what we posit is that cultivated meat, or the way to grow meat in vitro cultures, could be an effective way to address this challenge, right? It is an intensive form of cultivation. What it does is it reduces the amount of land that is required to grow an equivalent weight of meat significantly, about 99% of the time. Similarly, water can potentially be reused, because these are intensive forms of agriculture, and the water is in a closed loop. You could potentially reuse most of the water that is being produced. In many jurisdictions which have a lot less land than what we do, food security is an important issue. So countries like Singapore, in the Middle East, Japan, for example, don't have enough land to feed their people. And in those cases, this intensive form of cultivation is quite useful. And if we manage to use renewable sources of energy. So this kind of cultivation requires significantly more energy than what we would have in farm-based agriculture. But if we use solar energy or nuclear energy, renewable sources of energy, then we can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture as well, right? So this is a potential solution for many of the challenges that the world faces at this time. Now, growing meat in vitro cultures is not necessarily a new area. It has been around in the biomedical sphere for quite some time. So, for example, this is work from 1971 on smooth muscle cells in culture, and what they found was with these things you can grow fibrillar structures, right? So these cells fuse with each other naturally in vitro like settings, right? And then later on, in 75, skeletal muscle cells were found to not only make fibrils or small connections between the cells, but actually form fibers, just like what you have in meat, right? So this is all without animals. This is in cell culture plates. You can form these kinds of fibers that provide the textural feel that you would have when you consume meat, right? And this sort of prompted many people in the 1990s to think about why can't we produce meat in an in vitro setting rather than in an animal. And so William Van Ellen is known as the godfather of the cultivated meat area. He was one of the first person to patent this, so industrial production of meat from in vitro cell cultures, and actually seed funded a lot of early research in Europe in this particular area. And then in the early 2000s, NASA actually funded some of the research in growing in vitro meat-like structures, and this was meant to grow meat in space environments, right? So outside Earth, in Mars, and other settings. And in these cases, what they used was skeletal muscles from fish. Fish apparently is an ideal animal or organism to start, being that fish cells naturally divide, and therefore they can be expanded quite easily in that fashion. And then later on, Vladimir Murnau, and then he was then at University of South Carolina, proposed sort of an integrated development process, which is still followed to this time, where you take biopsies from an animal and then expand that in a bioreactor form and then assemble them into a form that can produce the taste and texture of meat. Unfortunately, that was not funded, but then he wrote an opinion piece on it, and that sort of guided many people across the world in order to pursue this form of research. In the early 2010s, the Dutch government was very proactive in funding this research. Again, Netherlands being a country with a lot less land, but very highly skilled agricultural community, was keen on this area, and they funded work in stem cell biology, tissue engineering, growing culture media, and so on. The result of that was one of the first lab-grown burgers, right? That was developed. This is the $1 million burger. It took about $1 million. Part of the funding came from Larry Page in Google, and Mark Post was the person who first did this. And the idea there was we can grow these aggregates, cellular aggregates, in the lab, and then use normal meat processing technology to pack them with binders, and then we can produce a burger-like structure, right? So this was one of the first demonstrations that something like this could be done, albeit at a very, very high cost. And then that sort of kick-started a revolution in the sense that venture capital community saw a significant way to disrupt the existing meat industry, and that led to funding of a huge range of companies, right? And this is sort of accelerated over the past few years as well, in terms of looking at various forms of this cultivation, right? Trying to bring the cost down and also develop some foundational technologies in this area, in the area of cell line development, in the area of culture media for growing these cells, what kind of scaffolds should we use in order to get the texture that is associated with meat, as well as large bioreactors that can actually generate the volume that is required if we want to replace a significant fraction of meat consumption in the world. However, all of these research has been siloed. These companies don't reveal much because that is their proprietary technology and so on. And so there's an active need for public research in this area to identify the cost benefits to the society, but also the health benefits associated with this kind of a technology, right? The process is a straightforward process. This is sort of the workflow of cultured meat process. Starts with an animal and a biopsy from the animal. And what you can do is you can extract stem cells from it, or you can extract these cells, satellite cells, which are stem-like in the muscle itself. And then you use some form of bioreactors to expand the cells, make many, many more cells, and then a way to assemble these cells, right? You can make an unstructured product if you create cellular aggregates and put a binder to it, and you can create a burger-like formulation, or associate with meat as well, right? And it is in this area that my research comes in. We are also sort of pioneering a way to tune meat. For instance, you can change the composition of fat and muscle content in the meat, and therefore you can personalize the tastes of these meats. You can also incorporate plant fiber into it and make it much more nutritious. So the in vitro culture allows you the ability to tune meat in a very exquisite kind of way when it is not possible otherwise. So there's a number of scientific and economic challenges before this actually comes to the market. One is, of course, cost. I showed you the $1 million burger. That cost has significantly come down over the past 10 years. Now you can, or companies do produce burgers which are maybe $1,000 a piece, if not lesser. But it's still, the cost has to come down. And this is one of the primary challenges in this field. The other is, what kind of cells do we use? Do we use biopsied cells from animals and then use those isolate the satellite cells and expand them, or do we use stem cells in this process? Another major area is serum-free growth media, right? So most of the media that we use for growing cells use bovine calf serum, which is again from an animal source. And there's an active research in terms of replacing it by defined chemical medium that can avoid this as well. And then huge bioreactors. So if you look at the bioreactors that is necessary to replace 5% of the global meat consumption, that will be 20 times the bioreactors that are currently available in the world for pharmaceutical production, right? And the pharmaceutical process of producing these ingredients is way too expensive. It may be okay for health applications, but not necessarily for food applications. So there's a revolution that is needed in terms of different kinds of bioreactors that are suitable for food growth. And then finally, this is by far the more important thing: can we get the texture? Can we get the taste? Because from a consumer perspective, this is the two more important things for acceptability, and that is another active area of research. And then finally, can we create tissue-like structures by creating exercises? And we know that exercise generates a lot of factors in the muscle tissue that are beneficial. Can we recreate some of these things in these in vitro cultures as well? So these are some of the scientific questions. What we have formed is an academic research center with these 5 universities and a number of about 15 researchers or so involved, looking at the various aspects: creating new cell lines, doing fundamental tissue culture work, developing new growth media, working with the government in order to define what should be the standards. How do we evaluate meat? What do we say is good and bad using genomic and proteomic technologies? And as well as looking into maintaining biodiversity, because if you can tune and if you can tailor meat, you can basically personalize the composition of the meat based on your personal preference. And what we expect is that that will increase the biodiversity of the meat that is being consumed in the world. So this is sort of my final slide, and this is again a new area in Canada, and we hope to expand interest in this area and research in this area over the next 10 years or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Selvaganapathy, for your amazing talk. I'm now pleased to present our last speaker, Dr. Sarah Elton. Dr. Sarah Elton is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the Toronto Metropolitan University and is the founding director of the Food Health Ecosystems Lab. Her lab explores the human ecosystem's health nexus in 3 contexts: produce supply chains, urban gardens, and the human gut microbiome. She's also the author of several award-winning books, including Consumed, Food for a Finite Planet. Thank you, Dr. Elton, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Wow, so interesting. Different approaches to thinking about health and food. So I want to know how many people here, let me just start my slides. How many people here like to eat healthy? They think, okay, that's a value for me. I'm eating healthy. Okay, a lot of people. Not everybody does. It's a food value, right? I do. I like to eat healthy. So each one of us is going to have a different idea of what is healthy food, but we probably could agree on some basics. So let's check out this salad. Would you say it's healthy? If you put up your hand if you think this salad is healthy. Looks healthy, yeah. So we have the greens, spinach. What's it going to provide us? Some nutrients, feed our microbiome, our gut microbiome. Almonds are rich in nutrients like magnesium. Oranges offer us some fiber, some vitamin C, right? But I'm going to take a little different spin on health and food today. We're going to talk about the ecological determinants of health. So this concept comes from public health. It offers a different way of thinking about health and food that asks us to think about health beyond our own bodies. So it reminds us that when we eat, we are connected to ecosystems, and it reminds us that our health is interdependent with the biosphere. So I'm a social scientist. I'm a critical qualitative health researcher. So I study food systems, and one part of my research program involves studying produce supply chains. So these are the food systems, the produce supply chains that make it possible for us to buy all these ingredients here in the Northern Hemisphere in Toronto 365 days a year. So I look at what is happening in the food system to bring you healthy fruits and vegetables, starting at the farm, and I follow it all the way down the supply chain through the retailers. And so I take a systems approach to thinking about food, and I also take a systems approach to thinking about health. So how many people have heard of the social determinants of health? Put up your hand. Okay, a lot of people. It's a concept used a lot in public policy. You can read about it in the newspaper. The social determinants of health are what the World Health Organization calls the non-medical factors that shape your health and influence your health outcomes. What we know that conditions that people are born into, like the conditions in which they work or the which they live, these combine with larger social forces like policies, like social norms, and these things come together and they influence your health. So there's this general understanding that what makes a person healthy goes beyond the choices that we make to eat that healthy salad, for example, and go beyond the choice to exercise. So researchers agree that there are these other factors beyond our control that shape our health. Beyond our control. So the ecological determinants of health, they determine our health in the same way. They are forces that exist around us that we're connected to that determine what our health is. So, for example, this is a nice diagram. This is from the Canadian Public Health Association. So the ecological determinants of health are the 3 primary ones, very obviously: oxygen, food, and water. We were reminded this week very well about the importance of oxygen in our determinants of health. I usually make a joke about that, but the joke is not funny this week in Toronto. Soil systems are another ecological determinant of health. Why? Because it cycles nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that make the plants, that help the plants grow, and therefore we get healthy fruits and vegetables to eat. There are other determinants of health, water systems to purify water, and then there are other determinants of health also. So these are the prime ecological determinants of health. I've argued that actually the human microbiome should be included in, the earth microbiome, including the human gut microbiome, should be included in these ecological determinants of health. So this concept is super helpful in reframing what health means when it comes to food. It frames health when it comes to food beyond what we choose to eat. So the ecological determinants of health ask us to think about the healthiness of ecosystems that produce the food, rather than just thinking about how healthy is this food for my body. So if the way a food is produced damages biodiversity by killing pollinators, then the food endangers the ecological determinants of health. If the way the food is produced pollutes the water and destroys marine ecosystems, then the food that we're eating is endangering the ecological determinants of health, and therefore it's endangering your health too. Because remember, our health is inextricably connected to the biosphere. Same thing for the food that is transported to you. If it's transported long distance, it generates greenhouse gas emissions, and then it's also endangering your health because transportation emissions are contributing to climate change. And then, of course, that's bad for your health, again, as we were reminded this week. The same goes for packaging. All that plastic wrapped around your food, what happens when that plastic makes its way into marine ecosystems and accumulates there? This is also hurting your health. So whether or not you eat the seafood that's contaminated with pollutants, and whether or not you choose to eat the fruits that are grown with pesticides, for example, that kill bees and other insects, regardless, when we analyze the healthiness of food from an ecological determinants of health perspective, we find that everybody's health is shaped by the food system. So again, regardless of what choice you make for dinner tonight. So let's go back to that salad. How healthy is this salad? Let's start with the almonds. So most almonds are grown in California. 80% of global almond production takes place in California. Almond production there is seriously depleting groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley, where many of these almond orchards are located. And groundwater is not like surface water. Groundwater is typically extracted from deep water aquifers, and these do not replenish with rainfall. So irrigation in almond orchards in the San Joaquin Valley in California, this is seriously depleting groundwater there. According to one life cycle assessment of commercial almond milk made from nuts grown in irrigated orchards in California, a 1.5 bottle of almond milk equals 175 kilograms of fresh water and irrigation. Weird to compare volume and like these quantities. That's what the study does. So pretty big impact. Let's look at the orange segments. It won't let me go back. There we go. Let's look at the orange segments. Oh no, I do want to go there. Sorry. So this is a slide from my research into supply chains, and this is a trip that an orange will make from South Africa to Toronto, if it's coming from South Africa, obviously. We know that from an article published last summer in the journal Nature Food that 20% of food systems emissions come from transportation. And we know that fruits and vegetables make up 36% of these emissions. So that is the long route of an orange will take to get here if that's where that is being sourced. Let's talk about the lettuce. Lettuce opens us up to the conversation of climate change again. Let's assume our lettuce comes from Yuma, Arizona. So that's where a lot of Canada's leafy greens come from during the months of, from November to April. And a long drought in the west is contributing to water shortage there. The Colorado River that farmers use to irrigate the land where lettuce is grown is drying up. Yuma is facing water shortages, and right now farmers are lobbying for the government to ensure that they can continue to get access to the water they use to irrigate their crops. But when we think about this from an ecological determinants of health perspective, we might ask, where is the best place to be growing lettuce? And should lettuce be grown in the winter in land that needs to be irrigated from a river that's drying up? So how many people have changed their mind about this salad? Have I convinced anybody? I convinced myself. I see some hands. Of course it's complex, right? It can be healthy for your body and not healthy for our ecosystems. But what I'm asking you today is to think about, if it's bad for ecosystems, is it really good for our body if it's contributing to climate change and damaging the life support system that is the biosphere? So what we choose to eat is really important, but it's also important to think about the whole system and to make choices, including supporting policies that promote the ecological determinants of health. So the ecological determinants of health can help us to think differently about our health. They remind us that we're inextricably connected to the processes of the biosphere. They remind us that health is not just about what we eat, that healthy food is about food systems, and that means it's about land use, and agriculture. So we can apply this ecological determinants of health framework to government policy making. So for example, right now our provincial government is planning to build the 413 highway on farmland, and they're taking agricultural land out of the greenbelt, out of the protection of the greenbelt, so developers can build housing on this land. If we apply an ecological determinants of health framework to these decisions, we can assess the health impacts of these decisions. So it's important to think about ecosystems behind the plates of salad that we eat. Because we are all connected to the biosphere, it is really about our health fundamentally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elton, for that wonderful talk. So I would like to extend our appreciation to Dr. Alsoemi, Dr. Davison, Dr. Salvagunapathy, and Dr. Elton for their very insightful talks. So everyone, please join me applauding our panelists and moderators. So we will now start a 45-minute break. We will be serving food from now until 8:20ish, so 8:20. So please make your way to the courtyard to grab some delicious bowls of food from our caterer and Perfect Eats. You will be given the bowl you selected upon registration. There will also be some fun treats from our second caterer, Happy Pops. Just a quick note, please be advised that food is prohibited in the theater hall. And also, just be aware that you could also participate in our spice workshop, and where you get the create and take home your own Moroccan spice mix and learn about its health benefits. And make sure to visit the Live-In Protein booth to learn more about how they repurpose underutilized plant materials to brew proteins. Lastly, there will be a board in the lobby where you can add your thoughts on what you learned from the talks, draw your favorite food, and just let your imagination run wild. Please ask our volunteers for a post-it and add it to the board. And don't be shy to mingle, and let's dig in. Okay, I guess we're good.
Hello?
Oh, the battery died. Okay. Once upon a December. Alright, this should be good.
Is this water for me?
Sure, it could be.
It could be. All these glasses are for me.
I think we're gonna bring some water, more water here.
Say it again.
I think we're gonna bring more water as well.
Okay.
So yeah.
So is the plan? I'm going to stand here and they're going to sit there.
Um,
That makes the most sense, I think. Huh?
yeah.
We're getting a fifth chair too, but I think they're just getting it from outside. So there's some people sitting on them right now. But they'll
Is
bring
it better, do you think, if I stand? My dear, dear friends in nutrition, has this not been a simply spectacular evening thus far? Another round of applause. Well, I'm deadly serious when I say what an unbelievable evening this has been. Think about all the stuff that we've had since 6:30 this evening. We have, for example, well, we just had a wonderful meal served to us, provided by the way, Imperfect Fresh Eats, Happy Pops, and Goldstruck Coffee. Wonderful, nutritious meals we were just served in the company, in the socialization of like-minded individuals on a beautiful late spring afternoon/evening. And most of all, some of the most intellectually stimulating conversation that you could hope to ever achieve on a Friday evening. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the right place. Now, speaking of intellectual stimulation, this is me. I teach a course here at the University of Toronto, and they gave me, I only have a few minutes. I can't go on too long, so I'm going to be very, very brief. Some of my students might find this to be shocking that I'll be so brief. There are a few of you here, I think. Some former students of mine? Someone was here. A few of you were here. Anyway, my students will know that one thing that I do like to do is I'm a fan of quotes. So if I only have 2 or 3 minutes, a quote might be a good thing to say. And one of my favorite quotes was very applicable this evening. Some of you may have heard it. I apologize if this is a hackneyed quote. I don't know who knows what quotes, but the one I've often used is, and you might even fill in the blank here, if you find yourself being the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. I can tell you personally, I'm in the right room here this evening. The brain power, not just on the panel either, by the way. You folks in the audience, all very, very keen-minded individuals that showed up here Friday evening for a wonderful, wonderful evening of intellectual stimulation, good food, and good friends. And now we have arrived to the part of the evening where we're going to have some more kind of socialization, if I can make it so. This is the moderated panel discussion of the evening. And we have our 4 esteemed speakers that are all going to take part. My name again is Dennis Collier. I'm going to be the moderator for this segment of the evening. Now, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen before it happens, just so we're all on the same page. Each of these speakers are going to be asked questions by me. There's already been a great outpouring of questions, both online and predetermined questions. So I'm going to stick to that a little bit, and then we're going to open up the floor to anybody in the audience who is so inclined to grab a mic and ask a question that came to you during one of the great talks earlier in the evening. I'm going to ballpark this. This may occur within the next 23 minutes. Around the halfway point is when we might open it up, but of course you never know how these conversations go. I can't stick exactly to a timeline, but at about 22 minutes, we'll open it up to the audience. Prior to that, I'm going to go down the line here and ask each of our speakers a question. The topics of these questions fall underneath certain categories. And I won't tell you how many categories we have, but they're all fantastic. We'll see how many we can fit in. I could also suggest to our speakers, okay, when I ask you these questions, I'm going to ask you to synthesize your thoughts into the most succinct way possible. Maybe, let's say, a 3-minute synopsis of the question. Does that make sense? So each speaker will answer a 3-minute question underneath the general topic, and we'll go through this list to see how many topics we can get through. So each of you has one under each topic. Does that make sense? We're all clear? Do this for about half an hour, give or take, and we'll see, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So, folks, I think this is going to be wonderful. So then, without further ado, let's begin. And topic number 1, the general categorization of our first series of questions, is just an introductory kind of get to know my area of expertise, if you will. Spoken perhaps to the average person on the street of Toronto. So we don't want to hear too much about, the ongoing laboratory biomechanics of. Let's take it down to the grassroots level and give kind of summative introductory answer to your field of expertise. And that'll be the topic, the first category of questions that we'll have this evening. Sound good? All right, folks, we're all excited? Unbelievable stuff here, folks. You're in the right place here at the University of Toronto, I keep telling you. All right, first question underneath this topic. We'll go to Dr. El Sohemi. All right, so Ahmed, question to you, about 3 minutes or so. How does personalized nutrition, in your opinion, contribute to overall improved health outcomes?
Go.
Didn't it be
like
exactly
I'm on a game
3
show
minutes?
here. Am I going to win anything at the end, or do any of us win anything?
The winners are the audience.
All
Ahmed.
right,
The
okay.
winners are the audience.
Okay, feel the pressure. But actually, 3 minutes is very long. I was expecting I have to say this in 30 seconds, so I might
That'll be at the
regret-
end.
Yeah, okay. 30 seconds is better?
No. That's the last.
Oh.
That's the last series of. The last topic is like your 30 set, your elevator pitch, if you will.
Okay. I think I've used up a minute already, so now I have. So, why is personalized nutrition important for health? Well, I think nutrition in general is vital for health, and I don't think anybody would ever dispute that. And I think almost everybody recognizes at some level that what works for them might not necessarily work for somebody else. So this whole area, this whole field of personalization and customization, we see this beyond even nutrition, right? I mean, when you think of, when you go home and you watch Netflix, right? It'll give you, if you like watching, action adventure, it's going to recommend other action adventure movies, right? You're not going to say, oh, how about this chick flick? This might be of interest to you. Depends on what you like. So all this personalization, because it's all about kind of what works best for me. So when it comes to foods, again, whether it's taste or preferences, most people recognize that, whatever they enjoy or whatever, feels good for them might not be the same as somebody else, even within a family unit. So you often share genetics, but still, even in a family, depending on how the genes were inherited, one person could have lactose intolerance and somebody else might not. So again, when it comes to food, it's something that is so personal to all of us in terms of the choices that we make each time. And now that you recognize the power of genetics and all the discoveries that are being made, I think, we used to say this is the way of the future, but it's actually here and now, the present. This is not some passing fad. The genie is out of the bottle. There's no way we're going to go back to giving general recommendations for everybody as we begin to understand how people respond differently from others based on their genetics.
Great. Next question is to Dr. Davison. And your question is, Dr. Davison, can you discuss the roles that optimal nutrition plays in brain development and mental well-being?
Wow. So brain development and mental well-being. So nutrition has a lot of different roles in those two areas. I'll start with brain development. So as I was mentioning in the talk, the early years, the perinatal period up to 6 years of age, is very key for brain development. You get speech development, all these other elements of new things that are happening in childhood. And so there's research out there that does demonstrate there are key nutrients that are needed during this time, iron being a critical one for brain development, because without sufficient iron, it can really impact one's cognition. So definitely different nutrients are critical. And when we think about a lifespan perspective as well with brain development, critical at different times. So there are, again, guidelines out there to suggest at certain periods of our lifespan, we need to have more of certain foods. So, for example, in adolescence, women need more iron, for example, than males do. So there's really, with brain development over, the lifespan into pre-adolescence and into early adulthood, a lot of critical nutrients, folate and iron probably being the main ones. The other was mental well-being. So we can talk about nutrition with mental well-being being like the nutrients that we need to foster that, so to alleviate symptoms of depression, anxiety. But there's also other aspects of nutrition and food that come into play. So food being something that brings us pleasure. So there's that whole area of just where food, the socialization around food helps with mental well-being.
So with mental well-being, is it more of a global type of thing as opposed to a singular nutrient? Or a couple of singular nutrients?
I would say more so like the nutrition and the contextual factors around that. So the nutrients kind of come into play with that, but it would be more, the quality of the diet. So I'm not necessarily looking at the, individual nutrients, but the overall quality of the diet, diversity of the diet, like variety, moderation, those key principles when we think about diet, and then just the context around it. So again, food being kind of a social piece. When we think about mental well-being and people say who are struggling with their mental health, a lot of what works is developing food-related skills, community kitchens and community programming around food that helps with their mental well-being as well.
Mm-hmm. Do we have time for a quick story? I know I'm cutting into your time, but you jogged my memory of a great event that happened to me personally. Living in the city of Toronto, we never get to eat as a family too often. Panels were talking, kids are off doing soccer and this and that and this and that. When I go home to Newfoundland, we do eat together as a family. And this last time I was there, 3 generations in one room on a Sunday afternoon, eating food that probably none of us would say is particularly healthy. But you eat this big meal as a family, and then what do you do after the meal at noon? Take a nap. Also, arguably, you're not going to a spin class, you're napping, but the thought struck me, maybe this is the way you're supposed to be doing it. Anyway, that was my little interjection. I'll try to avoid these interjections. I can't help myself sometimes, as my students know. Anyway, let's move along here. Third panelist, we're going to go to Dr. Silva Ganapathy. And your question, sir, how can food engineering and innovative technologies contribute to creating sustainable and nutritious food systems that support well-being?
Without the cost in the picture. So I think the engineering, I'm an engineer, so I think engineering can lead to optimal solutions. And that is what we could do potentially with food. In this particular context, I think what we can do is meat has, in some senses, a negative connotation in terms of the health implications of consuming it. And that can be mitigated through engineering. So for instance, we can grow muscle cells on a plant-based scaffold, for instance, and therefore introduce fiber in meat, which is not possible with farm-grown meat, for instance, right? So those kinds of innovations are potentially possible. We can introduce different micronutrients as part of the growth medium that get incorporated into the cells. And this could be tailored, and tailoring is probably the most important element in the engineering of meat, in the sense that right now we don't have the flexibility as we would have for milk. For milk, I can get cream, I can get 3%, I can get 2%, I can get skim milk, and different people have different preferences. They may have different preferences in using them in different kinds of dishes, for instance, right? And that flexibility exists right now for products like milk, but they don't exist for meat. And that is something that can be brought in. It can also be brought in as a signature of the person cooking it. So a chef may want to have a personalized signature of a particular composition of cell types in the meat product that they are going to put out, and that is their signature. And that is something that they have evolved through the process of experimentation that they have done, very similar to what you would do with food. And that is something that can be brought in once you bring in this element of tailoring. And so one of the people that interacted with me when we published this paper on combining fat and muscle was one of the founders of molecular gastronomy. And what he was thinking of was that this could be an evolution of cellular gastronomy, where you can mix and match ingredients at a fundamental level in order to create compositions that are different, that are unique, and that will be signatures for chefs, for instance.
It's a fascinating field for sure. Okay, our final speaker underneath this first topic, we're going to go to Dr. Elton. Your question, let's talk from a global perspective. What are the connections between food security, sustainability, and health?
Ooh, that's a
in
challenging one. That's like a course. Well, they're all interconnected. And from my perspective, as someone who thinks about health and ecosystems, they are connected at many levels. So food security, there's various ways to measure food security. We know in Canada we have a high level of food security because there's food in our country. We also know there's a high level of food insecurity because I was at a conference last week and I learned horrifyingly that 1 in 4 children are eating from a food bank. So those are different kinds of food security. From one has to do with the individual or a family unit, and the other one has to do with a community or state. So from a global perspective, our food security and our health are bound up in our climate future. And so what we're seeing now is we have a global food system where you can source food from anywhere in the world. So one of my projects, I tracked the impact of the pandemic on global supply chains and local supply chains at the Ontario Food Terminal. This is a wholesale marketplace, 3rd largest in North America, just out in Etobicoke. And I tracked, okay, what's the impact of the pandemic here? We saw no food shortages, and that's because we have a system where if there's a drought in Yuma, Arizona, then the wholesaler just looks to Mexico where something's growing and buys from there or wherever. So it's invisible to us as a consumer. However, not invisible, but you have to really pay attention to labels and read news articles and go searching for that information. So from a global perspective, if we have more and more interruptions of ecosystem functioning due to climate, then our food security is going to be put at risk, and also our health, our access to nutritious foods, and also the impact of climate change and all its impacts on our health outcomes. So to tease these things apart is practically impossible. They are all bound up together, especially because the food system contributes substantially to climate change. It's one of the large contributors to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So this is why I am preparing a graduate course on this very topic to tease it apart, because it is just so complex.
It's a good synopsis, though. Okay, that was the first category. We're going to move on to the second category. One same format. Each of you gets a question underneath this topic, and we'll keep our answers to give or take 3 minutes. And we're back to Ahmed to get started. Ahmed, your question, actually, Ahmed, I have a personal connection to your question here. So, Ahmed, I first met Ahmed, this is a true story, in 2012. And I was at you might not even remember this, but I was at the Dietitians of Canada conference. I believe this is when nutrigenomics was getting launched. And it was at the 2012 in Toronto, Dietitians of Canada conference. It was the buzz of the conference. And everyone talking about this new thing, and it was so fantastic. You could test people's genes and determine what nutrients were suited to them. So here's the question, Ahmed. So going back to 2012, okay, to now, 11 years later, there have been, let's call them detractors along the way of the whole process, the science behind the process. My question to you would be, just in the interest of full disclosure, number one, what were the types of things those detractors, maybe say in 2012, were saying, and what information has come to light since then that has kind of, at least in your eyes, quashed those detractors?
That's a brilliant question. And it's tough to know really where to start, because I actually gave a talk again just a couple of weeks ago at the Dietitians of Canada's annual conference, and it was in Montreal. And it was, again, kind of looking back, 11 years. We actually launched the company Nutrigenomics on that date, June 12th of 2012. Yeah, it was a huge milestone. So
it was the buzz
on
of the
Monday is our 11-year anniversary, yeah. So at the time, I'm just trying to think, actually in my presentations, I have a slide called, What Do the Skeptics Say? And I list about 6 or 7 bullets and kind of go through them and show how these are no longer really issues. A number of them are kind of scientific. Things like where geneticists used to argue, oh, you can't just measure one single gene because we know that something like obesity is caused by hundreds of different genes and many, many environmental factors. And the response to that is we're not using single genes to predict obesity because we know that you cannot. But when it comes to the way genes affect our metabolism, absolutely, there are single genetic variations that can have a profound effect on how we metabolize things. A classic example is newborn screening, right? So inborn errors of metabolism. So every infant born in Ontario and most provinces, and all provinces actually, and all states, undergoes a battery of tests. And there are a couple of dozen tests that we used to call genetic disorders. But over 70% of them are managed by dietary means. And so a condition like called PKU, phenylketonuria, if you look at a label of a diet beverage that contains aspartame, there's a warning label on it. And it says, for those with phenylketonuria, be careful because this contains aspartame. So aspartame is made up of 2 little amino acids. One of them is phenylalanine, which is normally just innocuous. But a single genetic variation in some children prevents them from being able to metabolize this amino acid, and it builds up to causes severe neurological disorders. So that's just kind of a classic example of that. But the research that we do is different than what geneticists were doing. They were just trying to link genes to diabetes without taking into account physical activity, exercise, and diet. And obviously they weren't able to make any connections, and that's not surprising. So the field has changed and it's evolved in terms of how we do the science. And in some instances, we can absolutely look at single genetic markers. So like I said, that's just one example of some of the comments from a scientific perspective. But there's also other kind of broader social, ethical, legal issues that arise as well. Issues around privacy, confidentiality, data security. And so this is also something where we being the company Nutrigenomics goes to great lengths to ensure the anonymity of the samples. So our lab just gets a barcoded sample. There's no requisition, no name, no identifier. Whereas other companies, some of you might be familiar with like 23andMe and others, you have to put your age, date of birth, email, all kinds of identifying information. So not all genetic tests are created equally, but because we recognize the importance of confidentiality, we've set up a system to preserve that and to ensure that you cannot be identified if a sample gets intercepted. Another comment that has come up as well, where I don't know if we've fully resolved it, is those who are in the public health sphere argue that genetic testing is elitist and it's only for the wealthy. And while I recognize that cost and affordability is an issue, my response is, even if we gave away genetic tests for free, a lot of people can't really afford, as you mentioned, food insecurity is an issue. A lot of people can't afford to follow the recommendations for healthy eating. So I'm a huge advocate of, fair taxation, if you want to call it. A lot of people kind of grumble, no one wants to pay more taxes, but for us to live in an equitable society, we have to ensure that we're all paying our fair taxes so that we don't have 1 in 4 children going to food banks. I did my sabbatical in Copenhagen 10 years ago, and 55% of my salary went to taxes. But I never saw a single homeless person in all my time that I was there. So that's just a message, a little plug in terms of my political views. And so people are a bit surprised because they think I have a company that I might be kind of right-leaning and I'm all about cutting taxes. I think that's complete nonsense. I think for us to live in a just and social society, we have to pay our fair share and to make these technologies affordable to everybody.
Wonderful. Let's keep the line rolling here. Dr. Davison, you're up next, and your question is, has your research findings in nutritional psychiatry highlighted any specific dietary factors that have shown promise in promoting mental well-being?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different nutritional factors, right, is what you phrased it as, that contribute to mental health. So as far as we'll just start with the basics, the nutrients. And this is consistent with other research where there are key ones, such as folate. And just as a kind of connection to Dr. El-Sahomi, there's actually been research that shows certain people with treatment-resistant depression, if you add on a folate supplement to their psychiatric medication, that it can improve treatment-resistant depression. So other key nutrients, iron, a lot of the trace minerals, which we can struggle to get in our diets because we just need very minute quantities, and they may not be necessarily widespread across a lot of foods. So some key ones are like zinc, magnesium, chromium is another one. So the early research I did show correlation with a lot of those trace minerals. Other factors that contribute to mental health that are nutrition related, of course, is food security. So have researched a number of different food security in a number of different ways to kind of show that relationship. So one being a study that we did with the Canadian Community Health Survey data looking at mental health as the outcome and showing food security was an independent predictor, accounting for other health factors, the social determinants of health, those kinds of things, was an independent predictor of poor mental health. And other things that were included in that modeling to look at poor mental health was poor diet quality, and then the key nutrients, iron and folate. And then with food insecurity as well, just other research that we've done have looked at food insecurity in relation to immigration status. So when people immigrate to Canada, looking at the trends in food security over time and how that impacts mental health. So finding that food insecurity, which is particularly an issue for those that are new to Canada, like the first 5 years, again, that relationship with poor mental health. And also looking at food insecurity and its relationship with suicide ideation. So a lot of different mental health outcomes are associated with food insecurity. So you can look at depression, example. Beyond that, there are other nutrition-related factors. So we talk about diet and that kind of thing, but then the long-term effects of diet, which might be on our body composition, that kind of thing. So body composition, shown in a lot of different analysis that we've done with the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, seems to come through a lot. Nutrition risk, so that's a measure which looks at people's access to food. Are they able to, so these are older adults, can they adequately chew and swallow food, for example, or can, those kinds of things. So that is all built into nutrition risk. Yeah, so there's many different nutrition-related factors. I would say, of course, diet being a main one. Food security, over and over again, is huge.
Seems to be a recurring theme here this evening, the food security issue. And on that note, I'm going to take some poetic license here and skip ahead, because Dr. Elton, your question was related to this as well. Two-part question, actually. How can the implementation of sustainable food systems and supportive policies contribute to improved health outcomes at a population level? Second part of the question, are there any organizations or policies that actively hinder the achievement of this goal?
You ask very good, complex questions. The problem with food is it's so complicated, and so it's always like, where to begin? So could you ask the first part again?
Sure. How can the implementation of sustainable food systems and supportive policies contribute to improved health outcomes at a population level?
So I think, I'm just trying to think, what kind of policy? Of course, we have municipal, provincial, and federal policy in this country that can shape our health outcomes in terms of food. So I'm just deciding which level am I going to go to. I'm going to zoom into provincial.
Is that because it's the most important, do you think? Or just
no, there would be so different. Actually, the City of Toronto, for example, does so much amazing work on food and health. They need to do some advertising campaigns to let people know just all the innovative policy that's happening at the city level. I'm thinking about provincial because there's actually threats to our health at a population level that I alluded to in my presentation that come from provincial policy. So we know we have a real housing crisis like many other regions in the world, and the provincial government, one solution they have sought is to take land out of the green belt for developers to build houses on, build I can never remember which number it is, the new highway that north of Brampton, and also to change policy so that that the government of the province can override local government's decision about where to intensify housing. How are we talking about housing? What does this have to do with food? It has everything to do with food and population health, because if we want to have more sustainable food systems, which there is a widespread recognition that we need to move towards more sustainable agricultural practices than we do now at our federal government level and internationally speaking. So what does that look like? We need to change farming systems. Right now, if we're building on land where we could be growing food, and that means we have to import food from somewhere else, the chances of us having control over deciding how the food is grown that we want to eat diminishes. It's much easier to make policy that determines sustainable agricultural practices or food safety or whatever if it's happening in your own political jurisdiction. So that's one way. And then the other way, when we build on a wetland, because farmland is not just fields, farmlands are forests. Farms include forests and hedgerows, which have pollinator habitat and wetlands and all these varieties of ecosystems. So when we eliminate farms, we eliminate broad swaths of ecosystems, and therefore we're also damaging population health. So we are in a sort of a 911 crisis in our province at the moment, and we really need to protect these key pieces of our province.
It's a good message. Okay, and the fourth speaker in this topic, we're going to go back to Ravi. Ravi, your question. Are cell lines the most crucial component for future advancements in lab-grown meat? And what other factors have contributed to the complexity in producing this type of a protein?
I think, the cell lines may not necessarily be the key issue. The key issue is one of cost. And the ability to grow these cells on a massive scale at a reasonable cost. And so the two key technologies that are important are the kinds of bioreactors that we can grow. So currently the limitation is there is a particular cell density to which these bioreactors can sustain growth, after which the metabolites from the cells build up, and removal techniques are quite difficult. So that's in some senses one of the key limitations. If we can grow to say 10 times or 100 times more intensity, then we will need fewer bioreactors, and therefore we need to invest less in terms of capital cost to start production. The other key technology is, of course, growth factors for the cells to grow. And these things currently are supplied by calf serum, essentially, which is an expensive. And there are numerous attempts over the past 2 years or so. There's been two sort of recipes that have been published by different researchers around the world in order to facilitate this. And so those two factors, if we can bring down the cost of those two factors, I think that'll go a long way in terms of getting this cost down and therefore the technology widely available. The cell line is important in the context of jurisdiction. Europe, for instance, is significantly against genetic engineering and so on, and therefore extraction of, so using a biopsy, extraction of satellite cells and then expanding them is the likely path in Europe. North America and Asia are quite different in their acceptance, and therefore cell lines can be used for generation. What I expect in the next 10 years or so is that there would be cell banks that would be established, which will not only provide a continued source of cells, but also be repositories for biodiversity in population of animals that we use for consumption, human consumption. And that, to some extent, can be quite helpful in maintaining that diversity, which doesn't exist in the current industrial production methods that we use right now.
Okay, folks, we have about 18 minutes left here before we're going to conclude for the evening. I think now might be a decent time to turn it over to the floor. We could do this all for hours and hours. There's so many good questions here, but I know some of you have questions as well. So here's how this will work. We have two mic runners. So if you raise your hand, they will come find you. And if you'd like to ask your question, there's one down here in the front, two down here in the front. Oh, right in the second row. So we'll start with the questions from the audience. And if we run out of questions from the audience, I have tons more. But we have one here in the front.
Question for Sarah. What's your take on this idea of voting with your fork, and what role can consumers play in reshaping our food systems in a more healthy and sustainable way? Or is that just an idealistic idea?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So for those of you who might not have heard that expression, there's the slogan, and often in the local food movement, you need to vote with your fork and choose foods that support the kind of food system that you want. And of course, in our commodity system, there is weight to that, because it's true, if we choose to buy X over Y, that company or that farm will do better and is more likely to succeed. However, I do think we see the limitations of that. We need to have policy that supports sustainable food systems, and we need democracy to help us move in a direction that is more just and sustainable. And I think those two things are bound up together. Food justice, which is correcting long-term social and historical wrongs, like bound up in colonialism and how that plays out in the food system today, which social groups have access to healthier food or better jobs, et cetera, in the food industry than others, and food justice and food security. And I think we need government to lead the way in that. Yes, lead the way. So yes, important, but not exclusive. Like, we need to move beyond and there are, there are people doing some incredible things, like thinking about how do we support a community? Like in Toronto, there are these community farms where they're trying to decommodify food and do mutual aid. So how does a community grow food to feed people so that they don't have to have money to buy food, but the community's taking care of itself by growing food?
I have a question for Hamid. So when you talk about genetics, you think it's more important for genetics or epigenetics, or equally important?
Sure. So I think, again, I often get this question in terms of, epigenetics. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, it basically deals with other types of modifications to genes that are not, actually they can be inherited. So a classic example is a lactose intolerance, really, because as we know, you're born with the gene to have lactose intolerance or not, but almost all children can drink milk. It's not until they reach 7, 8, 9, 10 years old that they then begin to manifest signs of lactose intolerance. And that's due to an age-dependent epigenetic modification. So if you have the C allele, the C version of the lactase gene, when you reach a certain age, it gets preferentially methylated and causes silencing of the lactase gene. Whereas if you have the T version that does not predict lactose intolerance, it does not get methylated, and so you're able to produce it. So that's both genetics and epigenetics at play. Epigenetics is altering the expression of that particular gene. But you don't need to take a biopsy of a person's small intestine to look at whether or not it's methylated. You can just take a cheek swab and see if they have the C allele or the T. So epigenetics is important to understand the mechanism of action, but genetic testing can actually be used to actually predict the ultimate outcome. So the two are not exclusive, it's just one can be used in practice and the other is more for mechanistic basic research to understand.
Hi. Okay, I want to raise a question related to Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Current, right? Seems that you has been doing a lot of study and understand a lot about the nutrition. Yeah. So
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think that mic is on. The people in the back can't hear, I don't think.
It's okay? Okay. So I think you has been studying on the nutrition and know what nutrition is good for the person, customize the person. And you may already have a list of the nutrition, what's good for genotype A or genotype B, C, right? And currents, you may have knowledge and have a list of the nutrition, what nutrition is good for the mental health, good for depression, anxiety, stress, right? But I would raise the question is, your study has been also studied on the nature of the nutrition, the nature of the person or the patients, what type, what nature of the food is meet the setting nature of the person. Here, what I raise the questions related to maybe the other type of the knowledge, because among the people that will have, in general speaking, have a yin and yang type. That means, in specific condition, that means part of the people related to the yin type, that means they are cold type. Their body more cold. Other type is more hot, we call the yang type of body. There's obviously.
So perhaps we could generalize here, and someone could give a comment about what we'll call alternative types of approaches to nutrition, I think is what the gentleman is getting at. Alternative approaches to nutrition. Any one of the panelists might be able to comment about.
Why I raise such a question? Because it's a new aspect. So I explain a little bit more. Because from my own practice, I'm the registered Chinese medicine practitioner. We pay a lot of attention to the patient's nature. That's yin type, yang type. Okay, so if we use the same nutrition, same food on the different person, right? So that we have a different result. But here is, if you use the same one, good for someone, not good for the other one.
I think, Ahmed, that's largely what you do, eh? I mean,
absolutely. In fact, I was going to say a lot of what we do in nutrigenomics is to some extent rooted in some of those traditional Chinese practices, and also in Ayurvedic medicine. And so the idea, there's actually been some published research showing that. Again, I forget the different, is anyone familiar with Ayurvedic medicine? Yeah, can you tell, they're the 5, what are they called again? Chakras, yeah. So there's been research showing that it's similar to body type and composition and predisposition, right? The constitution, man's primary constitution, those different body types, whether it's yin or yang or the 5 constitutions, they've shown that they have different genotypes and they metabolize medications differently. So just like they metabolize medications differently, and traditional Chinese health practitioners used to prescribe based on that. And that's based on years of observation. What they were doing was essentially dosing the person, prescribing the medication based on their genetics, but not by testing their DNA, but observing their physical appearance and stature and temperament, which is rooted in genetics. So that was a great start, but now we can go beyond that, because that was kind of a crude measure of genetics. Now we can say, okay, I don't have to determine if you're yin or yang. I can actually sequence your DNA and say, okay, this is what will work best for you. But you're absolutely right. A lot of this was done in ancient Chinese and Indian medicine practices.
We do have a question in the back there.
So this question is for Dr. Elton, but anyone can feel free to respond. You showed us the perspective of how, like, that salad, for example, the oranges, can be harmful to our ecosystems because of the amount of water production used. But we're also aware of how much water is necessary for, like, meat production. So I just wanted to understand what that threshold is. Like, when is it too harmful, or when is it not, like, when it becomes beneficial?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because any agriculture causes environmental harm if you're thinking of in certain ways. So I have never seen a metric to measure, like, what's the point, like when at what point is it bad versus good. The way that people articulate what it looks like in terms of sustainable food systems is thinking systemically. So where do we have a circular system, a circular ecosystem where you don't produce waste, or where because there's a saying, waste, nutrients out of place are waste. So thinking, evaluating the system itself, and that is how one determines whether or not it's sustainable. We know that the industrial food system causes a whole bunch of food waste. It's more than 40% globally, same number in Canada, from not only consumers, but all along the supply chains, starting on the farm. And we know that that the industrial food system uses a lot of fossil fuels to plow and move and refrigerate, et cetera. So I think the idea is to evaluate the entire system. How sustainable is that system?
If I may add, just a quick point is that cost of the inputs for many of the agricultural systems are not taken into account, right? So water, for example, there is a big resistance to putting cost on water. And historically, the way that like almonds in California are great because you have the Colorado River supplying water, and these agreements have been made 100 years ago as to what the cost of water would be and which jurisdictions will get what amount of water and so on. So it's a completely a way where market forces don't come into play as to cost of the inputs in all of these things. If that is brought in, then you would see the price of the product actually change according to the inputs. And that, to some extent, is what is required.
We have time for a couple more, maybe?
Okay. Is it good? Hi. Okay. So my question is to Dr. Karen. I loved your study on the the fact that the supplements can help the disorders or the depression itself. And first of all, I should say, like, I myself, I am my own case studies, because having several traumas in my life, I started using vitamin D, B complex, and I definitely saw the the impact of those supplements on my mood, on my depression. And I love this, that it has actually been put into account. But then I moved to Canada, somewhere that has 6 months of dark days. And I started like telling people, hey, maybe you should have like vitamin D sometimes to start having, to stop your depression, because we see people have the depression 6 months of the month here. And I see that you are actually doing these studies in Canada where we have this problem maybe. So my question was more like how these studies are being used in real life for people that can actually be use this help of the studies, when maybe they don't know that just by having one vitamin D regularly, they can help their moods.
That's a really great question. So if I'm understanding it, it's kind of like, how do you translate the research into actual implementation where it's going to help people? So in the area of nutritional psychiatry, I have to say, because I work in the field too, that it's really come a long way in terms of, so in the psychiatric so there's guidelines for psychiatrists, the Canadian Psychiatry Association guidelines, where they actually have now omega-3 fatty acids indicated as a line of treatment, like a third line of treatment. And folate is another one. So there's a few now that they are actually considering as a line of treatment. So, you know, we're coming along in that regard. And surprisingly with psychiatrists even, right? They will even prescribe omega-3 fatty acids as adjunct to psychiatric medications. I still think we have a long way to go. There's a lot of skepticism amongst the medical professions in terms of supplement use, and really depends who you kind of talk to. So some will say, well, just take a broad spectrum multivitamin mineral supplement. Yet there are guidelines too when you talk about vitamin D, where at the age of 50, in the clinical context, any or those over 50 should be taking a vitamin D supplement along with calcium. So yeah, there's just so much more that could be done along that lines. And I think it ties into looking at the genetic component too. Like if sometimes supplements, depending on your gene test results, can be a strategy in an individual plan.
I think we have a few more hands up. Oh, question online.
Yeah, so as we're kind of running short on time, we just wanted to give the chance to the folks online to ask a question. So this will be our last question before the closing remarks from our speakers. So this goes to Dr. Salvagonopathy, and if you could just keep it short as you can. So it's actually two questions into one question. So people wanted to know, does the fake meat work for vegans as well? And what would be the timeline for the cultivated meat?
So I wouldn't call it fake meat. So I would say it is cultivated meat rather than fake meat. Essentially what we're trying to do, and the whole idea is to distinguish it from plant protein-based production of meat, right? In the sense that what we're trying to do here is to use cells and to try to provide it with the same kind of stimuli that the cells would have in an in vivo kind of system, and in order to grow structures and tissues in a form that is similar to in vivo, right? So that's the sort of qualifier there. And what was the question about? Timeline, yeah. So timeline is a question of investment in this area. So what we're trying to do is to promote research and development in these areas. Cost is the big factor in all of these things. Currently, there are products available in Singapore, for example, for human consumption, right? And so from a timeline perspective of when it would hit the market, it has already hit the market. However, if it has to have an impact on climate change, it has to have several of these challenges that I identify solved. Cost is one of them, but also the kind of energy that it uses is an important component in it as well, right? And so coupling renewable energy sources with production in this format, bringing down cost of producing large amount of cells, as well as using serum-free media, and all of these things play a role in the expanded availability of these things at a cost-effective basis that it could be consumed widely and therefore then have an impact on the society. The other important element is also regulations. Many jurisdictions don't have regulations on what these products are and how they can be made available to the public. And therefore, making sure that jurisdictions have good regulations is an important element in their widespread availability as well.
All right, folks, the last thing we're going to do, I promise we're going to do this. I'm going to put the four of you on the spot. Okay, you got 30 seconds. And what we're going to do, folks, is this. This is how I always end when I do these things. As I alluded to earlier, we have an unimaginable amount of brain power seating before you. Years of experience, decades actually, let's be honest, of experience. What they're each going to do is in 30 seconds or less, they're going to put together, you might call it a mission statement, a singular mantra that summarizes their wealth of experience as it relates to, and whoever wants to jump in first, there's a bit of improv here also that's going to happen. So whoever can go first can do that, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. But your task is, in 30 seconds or less, summarize the totality of your knowledge and experience as it relates to the most important thing to optimize human physical health, mental health, or overall well-being.
Just because I think people want to get going, I'll do it in 3 seconds.
Okay, let's do it.
Eat according to your genes.
There you go. Let's give a round of applause for that one. Anyone else?
Eat when thinking of relationships. So ecosystem relationships, starting in your intimate relationships you have in your gut, to all the way to the large scale of you and ecosystems that feed you.
Well done. Well done.
Make what you eat sustainable.
Dr. Davison?
I would say eat what makes you feel good. So that could be feeling good in terms of improving the environment, what's sustainable, what makes sense for you as an individual.
There you have it, folks. There you have it. I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful organizers here for the final remarks, and then we're all done for the evening, folks. But thank you for your time and attention this evening.
Thank you, Dennis. That's a tough act to follow. I just want to thank all of our speakers once again. And before we sort of close up, I don't want to hold you guys back too long, but the next thing is we just have our survey form. We would love to hear your feedback, and participation in this does enter you in for a chance to win one of 5 $50 gift cards of your choice. So I'll keep that up for a couple seconds to scan the QR code. And yes. Next, I'd love to call Dr. Mingyao Liu, our director of the Institute of Medical Sciences, to close us out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So my name is Mingyao Liu. I'm the director of IMS. So before I make a closing remark, I want to ask how many of you are not from IMS? Wow. So do you know what is IMS actually? No, you don't know? Okay. IMS is a stand for Institute of Medical Science. Actually, people think we are medical school, which is true. And people think we are actually pre-med, which is also true. People think we are research institute, which is also true. So basically, IMS is a place training the graduate student, master and the PhD in the medical science. So our trainees is mainly in the hospitals. So the research is the vehicle to training our scientists. But then you may ask why the student in IMS organize events like this. It's nothing to do with your PhD, with your master study. I think our student had using the research as a tool to training their critical thinking, to training themselves to become scientists. But they also know that we have a social accountability, and we are not just sit here to do some kind of a bench work, but also we need to disseminate the science to the community. So the UofT talk actually is one of this kind of a platform. It has been almost 10 years. As we introduced these annual events. Every year, the student pick up one particular subject. The subject will have to cross the 4 divisions, which is the social science, humanity, physical science, and the life science. I think the 4 panelists actually is a good example. They cross all these different pillars. And we want to discuss some issues that all the people interested. And also through this kind of a practice, we communicate as a future scientist with the public and also engage public for our science. I think that's the purpose. So I think you will all have to agree with me that our student did a great job. I think we should give them a big applause. And I was giving a 15 minutes speech about this acknowledgement, but then later on they said I only have less than 4 minutes. I already spent 3 minutes to talk about what is IMS. So I want to take this opportunity, really thanks Denise to be the facilitator for this wonderful discussion, and so happy to see you. And also I thanks our panelists. I think only one evening I feel like Ahmed, Ravi, Sarah, and Karen, all like honorable membership in IMS, and they helped us for this wonderful events. And also, I thank the student. You may or may not notice there's a lot of students who wear this the T-shirt with the UofT talks. So they should give me one because I attend almost every one of them. So they did a great job, and they volunteered, they planned everything, and they raised the fund, and they got everything well organized. So thank you guys so much. And also, I wanted to thank our community partners. So the fund they raised is from different groups, and they did a great job to sponsor our events to make sure that this will be well done. So before the final closing, I particularly want to thank Muzaffar and Ferry. I think two of them really lead the whole program and organized everything. So let's give both of them a big applause. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you. Okay, I promise that this is it. We thank everyone for coming tonight, our speakers, our community partners, our sponsors, Gurdon Foundation and SGS. Without them, we couldn't do this. And thank you to all you for being here, contributing to our event, and being fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yes. And lastly, we just wanted to call our organizing team onto the stage because they're the ones that made this night happen. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Can we have our speakers as well for photo? Thank you. Are we okay, or do we want us? Thank you, everyone. See you next year, and don't forget to fill out the survey.
Shall we go there?
Sure.
Also, lastly, there's some food left over. There's mugs as well. So if you want to take anything on the way out, you are free to. Thank you.